On the demand side, I'm expecting more financial intermediaries to come into this market that will be taking speculative positions. And we will see much more complex financial structures coming to market. And I think that will all happen in 26. So I think 26 is going to be an extremely exciting year, both from a supply and demand point of view, really moving to a much more mature market.
Carbonsations, today's carbon industry leaders.
Are you passionate about climate action and staying on top of the latest trends in the world of carbon capture, removal, and markets? Then the Carbon Herald has you covered. Every week, we bring you the top news, breakthroughs, and insights from the world of carbon management, delivered straight to your inbox. No fluff, no jargon, just the essential info you need to stay informed. So whether you're a climate professional or just someone who cares, make sure you're subscribed. Visit carbonherald.com and sign up today for our weekly newsletter. Welcome to the Carbonsations podcast, where we speak to some of the leading figures in the emerging carbon industry. Today, our guest is Jan-Willem Bode, CEO of the world's leading crediting platform for engineered carbon removal, Puro.earth. Jan-Willem, thank you so much for joining us today. It's a pleasure to have you on the show. And especially as this is our last episode for 2025 and set to be the first episode to air in the new year, it's a wonderful opportunity to summarize what this year has meant for carbon removal. And I think you're one of the best people to offer their perspective on this matter. But before we do that, however, we do like to get to know our guests a little bit better before diving into the carbon side of things. So it would be lovely if we could please just talk a little bit about your background and how you essentially ended up in this industry.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me here, Violet. And it's an absolute pleasure to be here. To be honest, my journey in carbon markets and sustainability as a whole actually goes back all the way to when I was a teenager. I was an avid scuba diver, and I personally saw the damage that climate change can do to coral reefs. And that's when I knew I wanted to become active in doing something with climate change. Let's put it like that. So actually very early on, I was involved in policy development around the Kyoto Protocol, et cetera. And after a couple of years in consulting in academia, I saw carbon markets as one of the most promising tools to do something about climate change. So in the early 2000s, I got involved in setting up a carbon credit project development business and trader, which then after the financial crisis, we sold to, or during the financial crisis, I should probably say, we sold to Société Générale, to RBO. And I've been basically been very, very fond of carbon markets ever since. So, very much started my career doing things like writing the gold standards, version 1 and version 2, developing tens and tens of projects in this space. Then took a couple of years out because I actually wanted to make sure that I still believed in carbon markets as such. And then 6 years ago, I was asked to join the board of Puro. So initially, I spent the first 5 years in my involvement at Puro as a non-executive director on the board. And then was asked about 10 months ago to take over as the president of Puro. And it's been an interesting period.
Wow, that really is an interesting biography. You're really like one of the founding fathers of carbon markets back when nobody really knew what that is. So I know most of our listeners know about Puro and what you guys do, but for those who might not be that familiar, I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about the organization's mission and what role you play in the broader carbon removal ecosystem.
Yeah, I think it was about 7 years ago when the co-founders of Puro realized that there were quite some activities going on in the engineered removal space, but contrary to reduction and avoidance projects in the carbon credit space, there was no standard. So 7 years ago, they launched Puro.earth, very much with the idea of being one of the, let's call it one of the pillars that the engineered removal market can build on. So Puro was the first registry to launch, first set of methodologies in the engineered removal space. And then obviously since there have been more parties coming into the market. But that is kind of where Puro started. The real focus was on innovation, the assumption is, and has always been, that engineered removals are a very different asset class than emission reductions or avoided emissions. And the philosophy very much was that, and still is, that this is an asset class that needs to be treated differently. It needs to be treated differently from a methodology point of view. It needs to be treated differently from a certification journey point of view. As a very concrete example thereof, counterfactual baselines that are absolutely critical in emission reduction and avoided emissions projects are a lot less important within the context of engineered removals. But at the same time, there's much more scientific uncertainty on the engineered removals side of things, because often these are new project types, new technologies that need to be developed. And that means that you also need to treat those asset classes in a different way, which is why we developed a certification journey that was very much geared towards that engineered removal asset class. And we built that ecosystem. We built the foundations of that ecosystem. And then when NASDAQ came in as a shareholder, that kind of really made it clear what the DNA is that we want as a firm. We want to be one of the trusted parties in this ecosystem that provides the foundations for engineered removals, and to make sure that if we issue a cork, issue an engineered removal credit, that people know that is representing a ton of CO2 being removed from the atmosphere. So our role is very much that, developing new methodologies, running a registry, but really creating that one of those pillars in the ecosystem that provides a real feeling of trust.
So yeah, in that line of thought, I was wondering actually, since you mentioned corks, as this like kind of benchmark for quality, what would you say makes the Puro standard different from the others out there?
I think, one, the fact that we have got 6 years of history in this space where we really have gone through iterations of methodologies. We've now got 100 projects that have issued credits onto our platform. So there's a lot of experience that comes with that, one. Two is, we've also spent quite a lot of time over the last couple of years, and especially over the last 12 months, where we really have started to adapt our certification journey to be much more aligned with what the requirements are of projects. So when it comes to, for example, making projects more bankable, making sure that the certification journey is in line with project milestones rather than with relatively arbitrary milestones that are being put upon the system from a carbon markets point of view. So we really are taking that idea of infrastructure, financial infrastructure, as the core in all our thinking right now, which is based on 6-7 years of experience. And so where in the first 4 or 5 years, the focus was very much on innovation, we are really now switching to go from innovation to financial infrastructure. We see ourselves as a part of a financial ecosystem. And that also means that you need to treat the way that you build that ecosystem, and you need to treat the role that you play in that ecosystem in the same way as if you were playing in a financial ecosystem. And that means that you need to start looking at all the reliability, trustworthiness, etc., that comes with participating in a financial ecosystem.
So would you say that as far as like methodologies and certification and all of that, your work pretty much is done? Like there's a solid enough foundation already there?
So we developed a whole number of methodologies, and there is about 8 or so that are currently approved and in the public domain. But the way we look at that is that we review those methodologies every 2 years. And the reason for that is not because we don't think that those methodologies are solid, but basically because there are developments in the science around these technologies that we're talking about. And when we review them, we can come to a conclusion that either they're pretty much okay as they are, or they need a minor upgrade, or they need a major update. But that is more than anything, that is determined by scientific developments rather than anything else. And yeah, we do have a number of methodologies that are really seen as top in the class when it comes to quality. So that is definitely the case. we very much focus on those methodologies where we feel that over the next 2, 3, 4 years, real scale will come from, because what this market needs is scale. It needs scale and it needs reliability. So that is our main focus. But it's very much a matter of making sure that those two methodologies keep on being developed in line with scientific developments, as well as additional requirements that are being put upon us by the various regulators in this market.
But as far as credibility goes and like making sure that that's, transparency is like probably the main thing we need in order to ensure that the carbon market can actually grow and deliver meaningful impact. So would you say that methodologies are essentially the main mechanism for that?
Methodologies, as well as the information that is being put into into the registry environment, as well as access to data, public consultations, etc. So all the stuff that are sitting in the methodological requirements and the general rules requirements. And so within that context, ICVCM is an important organization as well, because it kind of put the minimum standards on programs. So all those things are extremely relevant within the context of transparency, trust, and reliability.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned the ICVCM, given that a very recent development for Puro, the fact that you were granted core carbon principle eligibility from the ICVCM, which, first of all, congratulations are in order for that. But secondly, what can you tell us about this event and what implications will it have for both Puro, but for the industry at large as well?
Yeah, so I think just to go back a bit, we, as I said, we spent quite a large time on getting our own program up and running. And then ICVCM came along well into our history, effectively. So we've been operating for 3-4 years, and then ICVCM came along. And so what we did is, because we had developed our own systems, we actually had to make sure that our most recent general rules are very much in line with ICVCM requirements. And that doesn't mean that we don't think the programs before that were right. It's just that basically what we needed to do is look at what we had developed and where we had very much focused on innovation, how that actually fits within the sandbox that the rest of the world is playing in. So that's what we've been doing over the last period of time, and that's how we've ended up in a situation where actually we are now ICVCM eligible, but at the same time we've managed to maintain a lot of the innovative elements that we have that were a bit different than other players in the market. And as an example, we pay for the auditors directly as Puro, and one of the implications thereof is that we actually have an additional eligibility step within our certification journey, where we internally look at the quality of projects before we send them out to third-party validators. And there's those kind of things that are a bit different than a lot of the other standards have. And that is basically has to do with the fact that we think that it's really important to make sure that the quality of projects is as high as possible before it goes to third party, goes out for third-party validation. And what it means is that now with the ICVCM accreditation, the suppliers that work with us and the buyers that buy credits from our suppliers get the best of both worlds. So on one hand, you've got the innovation that came around the development of an engineered removal ecosystem before other people were even looking at it. And secondly, it is done in a way that actually it fits within the sandbox that everybody else is playing in. So you get the best of both worlds. You get, on one hand, the innovation that we've been working on for such a long period of time. But on the other hand, you also get an internationally recognized stamp of approval of it.
And do you think this will in any way affect buyer behavior? Are you seeing it already affecting buyer behavior in any way?
So so in general, when it comes to the CCP label, so independent of engineered removals, we do see that there is a price premium on credits that have got the CCP label over credits that don't have the CCP label, which obviously is a reflection of maybe not necessarily of higher quality, but at least of a more internationally recognized stamp of approval, so to say. What we have not seen yet in the engineered removal space concrete demands for CCP credits. And the reason for that is more than anything that the volumes are extremely low of those credits into this space. But I do expect that will change over the next maybe 12, 24, 36 months. As soon as we see more volume of CCP labeled engineered removal credits going into the market as well.
Yeah, that kind of brings me to the general carbon removal market, as it is the end of the year, and I'd love it if you could dive into perhaps like what changes you've noticed in the market so far and what major trends, whether good or bad, have kind of set the tone for these past 12 months.
I think the last 12 months have been very, very interesting. So on one hand, initially we saw demand for credits, and especially demand for spot delivery of engineered removal credits go down before it actually started picking up again during the course of 2025. So I think that's one. Two is we've seen more and more projects being developed that have got very high capex investment costs and actually are looking for a much more solid infrastructure in order for those projects to be bankable as well. So the last 6 months, we've seen more unique buyers coming to the engineered removal space than we've seen for years before that. So that is an interesting trend. So what we see is a lot of buyers looking to, let's say, dip the toes in the water of engineered removal markets. There are really a lot of unique buyers that are buying relatively small volumes in anticipation of buying larger volumes over the next couple of years. The other thing is on the buy side, we also see a couple of intermediaries, more than a handful actually, of intermediaries coming to market. So we actually see people taking positions in engineered removal credits in a more speculative manner. So both those things show me that it is quite likely that liquidity in this market will increase next year and the year afterwards quite dramatically. I mean, if you go back to the voluntary carbon markets in the around 2004, 5, 6, 7, it basically needed a couple of intermediaries to come to markets to start creating demand, to start taking naked long positions, and that effectively meant that there was almost a guaranteed demand for credits, and we see that. The other thing we see is a lot more financial intermediaries looking at more advanced financial structures. So, for example, we see financial intermediaries offering floor prices on projects, which is extremely helpful to get these projects across the line when it comes to from a financing point of view. And if you start, that's typical behavior of a market that is maturing. If you then start looking at the regulatory side of things, you see the European Commission providing more and more clarity when it comes to the CRCF and the rule of removals thereof. The most recent consultation coming out of SBTI also provides more clarity. So overall, the trend is very much up. And if you then look at what it means from a Puro point of view, we've really focused over the last 6-7 months to make sure that we develop the right technical infrastructure in order to support that. We launched My Puro 2.0, which is very much an upgraded version of our portal for suppliers and buyers, which provides a lot more insight into what the requirements are that suppliers need to comply with, what the documentation is that they need to upload. It's a much more seamless type of functionality for them. We've also launched the DMRV API, so this is effectively an interaction for DMRV providers directly into our registry. And then we're also looking to launch the much improved issuance functionality, where we'll be moving from annual or monthly issuance of credits to issuance on demand. And the reason for that is that all those things will help with making these projects, the big projects especially, more bankable. And if you put the benchmark from a functionality point of view quite high for big projects, then it will also trickle down for the smaller projects, and the experience for development of smaller projects will automatically become easier as well. So I think if you add all of that up, on one hand, after initial dip in 25, when it comes to demand, we massively saw an uptick when it comes to number of buyers, type of buyers, and also we saw the innovation in financial products that are being offered. And then on the supply side, we saw more and more projects moving much closer to final investment decision and start build also on the large end of the spectrum. So combine that with a regulatory environment that becomes more and more supportive. I'm actually excited, very excited about 26, 27, 28.
Okay, so a lot to unpack there, but just kind of a last question perhaps on the buyer side. Have you noticed changes in the way they approach purchasing carbon removal? Like, have buyers become more, like, do they have more discernment now? Are they better aware of the market and the specifics of carbon removal? Is there any change there at all? Or is this kind of more of a role that the intermediaries are taking on?
I think we see, probably a bit of a mix of both. On one end of the spectrum, you've got really advanced buyers that know exactly what they want, have got their own in-house science teams, know how to look at projects on a project-by-project basis. So I think that is one. But on the other hand, we also see new buyers coming into the market that actually rely much more on either consultants or on financial intermediaries to determine what it is that they're going to end up buying. So we probably see a mix of both. And that second group of buyers, that is, I wouldn't say that they're less discerning, but they're probably relying more on other parties to determine the quality of the projects or to assess the quality of projects, rather than that they are building entire teams in-house to do that, which is, again, one of those indications that the market is becoming more mature and we are expecting more liquidity in the market as well.
Okay, and how about things on the supply side in that case? Like, are suppliers responding to any kind of signals that they're receiving on the buyer side as far as, like, looking for higher quality projects, etc.? Like, are there shifts there?
Yeah, I think there's probably a number of important shifts to mention there. One of them is that we see more project developers keeping on developing their projects and also directly investing in projects, even if they don't necessarily have an offtake agreement that covers a large forward flow of the credits coming out of the projects, which means that there is more trust from the suppliers into this market that there will be offtake. So I think that's one. I think two is that we also see suppliers, and especially at the large end of the spectrum, they're asking for more flexibility on the type of credits that the project will issue. And what I mean with that is, in Puro, we decided to onboard CCS Plus into our environment. The main reason for that was that we had suppliers asking for the ability to register their projects both under our own methodology for carbon capture and storage, our GSC methodology, as well as under CCS Plus. And the main reason for that is that they have got some buyers who've got a preference for one methodology and another for the other methodology. So we also see a stronger demand from suppliers to actually be a bit more flexible on the type of certification journey that we can take that project through. So in Puro, we very, very much responded to that by actually saying, yes, you can certify a project both on the Puro and as well as on the CCS Plus, or choose one or the other. And then you can actually serve as the demands of the buyers. And if you've got more than one buyer, especially, that is kind of relevant. So I think you see on the supply side very much an understanding of what it is that buyers really need. And as Puro, we will just basically accommodate that. Especially when it comes to the smaller end of the suppliers, we really see people being much less risk averse.
Okay, so that kind of brings me to the balancing of the equation. Since a question that's been talked about a lot lately is the impending shortage of high quality carbon credits. Some folks say that we're already in it. Others are saying that it's just around the corner. What's the situation looking like from your perspective?
Yeah, there's a big difference, I think, between spot and forwards and futures. On the spot side of things, we definitely see a shortage for specific project types. On the forwards, the future side of things, there's definitely a shortage at this moment in time. So I think it's, and we've seen that throughout the history of the voluntary carbon markets. There is buyer preference for specific project types. There is buyer preference for projects with co-benefits. There's buyer preference for projects, specific technologies in specific geographies. So I think the overall picture is going to be a bit more mixed than just saying that the market is going to be short supply or is going to be short demand. I think it will be, for the foreseeable future, the case that there will be shortage in specific project types and specific project geography combinations, whereas maybe other project types and other methodologies are a bit less popular from a buy side point of view. And I think we're moving very much from a project by project assessment period into a much more methodology standard assessment. So that means that we will see a change in buyer behavior there, where they will just start to trust specific methodologies and specific registries, independent of the underlying projects, much more than has traditionally been the case. And that should lead to an increase in speed of those transactions over the next couple of years. But yeah, so I think overall, we do see a shortage on the forwards, definitely. And I think that will keep on being the case for the next couple of years.
And in that line of thought, kind of how do you see Article 6 changing the market? Is it changing it at all at this point, or is that something that we're likely to only just see in the future?
So I think the Article 6 is an interesting one. So if you look at the voluntary carbon market as it is at this moment in time, most companies are buying removals as part of a overall carbon net zero or a type of approach. And if you then start looking at using removals within the context, for example, of Scope 3 decarbonization, Article 6 is a bit of a red herring in that you create credits in a country. They're being used by a company to neutralize their emissions in the same country. There is no international transfer of credits. It is very much sitting it stays within the voluntary carbon market space. There is no need, in my opinion, for Article 6 involvement in those projects. So I think Article 6 will change the market, but it will not be in the next couple of years. And I actually think that within the context of voluntary carbon markets, and especially within the context of Scope 1 to 3 climate neutrality debates, I actually think Article 6 may very well never play a very big role in that. Where it will make a big difference is where voluntary and compliance markets get together, or within the context of compliance markets as a whole. But that will all play out over the next 12, 24 months. We very much keep our eye on that within the context of Puro. And of course, our systems can facilitate Article 6 transactions, but it is not something that I think will be extremely important in the voluntary carbon market space over the next 12, 24 months.
So just to clarify, is it because you don't believe that we're looking at any type of convergence of compliance and voluntary markets in the next couple of years?
I don't. Well, so I actually think that sometimes even using the word voluntary compliance is a bit confusing. But no, I fundamentally think that there will be multiple markets sitting alongside each other. If you start looking at the impact of SBTi guidance, where it's very much talking about sector by sector approaches to decarbonization, I actually think that the role of engineers removals within that will also be very much sector by sector based, and I don't think there will be an Article 6 involvement. If you ask me whether there will be convergence from a methodology point of view, I do think that eventually methodologies will converge between Article 6, CRCF, our own methodologies, etc. But I think that is still, I don't know, 10, 15 years out.
Oh, wow. Do you believe that might be too long? I mean, it definitely sounds like it might be too long, 10, 15.
I believe that there will be a whole load of different markets sitting alongside each other. I think the voluntary carbon market in its own right is big enough to actually have a significant impact in the climate change problem that we are all trying to tackle here. And of course, compliance markets will help. But if we look at the past and how the time frames at which things can move and develop, I think we shouldn't wait for compliance markets, and especially not international compliance markets, to come in order to maintain momentum or increase momentum.
Okay. That was kind of going to be my next question for you, especially given, like you mentioned, the EU CRCF and the progress that's been made there over the past year. So what role would you say that policy plays in scaling carbon removal technologies at the moment?
It's always dependent on, in the end, on the details. But obviously the signals that are coming out of the Commission are quite bullish when it comes to the role both of removals that come from projects that are based in the European Union as well as international carbon removals. But again, the timeline there is super important. We're looking at 5, 6, 7 years from now when there's going to be significant demand signal coming out of the system there. The positive thereof is that it will actually provide a more secure demand signal, and it will also provide some price discovery for a lot of projects that are currently being developed. And given the fact that the very large projects typically take 3 to 5 years to develop anyway, it's an important demand signal. So I think what it does is exactly that. It basically provides some medium-term security when it comes to price expectations and demand expectations, which means that it's easier for developers to actually now start developing the projects knowing that there's going to be offtake.
So if you had to kind of really, really simplify it and boil it down to just like one single most necessary component in scaling this industry, what would you say that would be, like, to really reach gigaton levels of carbon removal?
I think we're actually not very far away from what I think is needed. We need medium long-term compliance demand with price signals, which is being created by CRCF and other compliance schemes in the world. 2 is we need clear guidance in the voluntary market about the role of engineered removals within the context of decarbonizing the activities of companies, most notably their supply chains, which we are getting within the context of SBTi. And that then will almost automatically lead to increased activity from financial players, financial intermediaries in the market, which we also see the beginnings of. So I think we've got the basic ingredients there. We're just waiting for more and more clarity in all those mechanisms. And as soon as that happens, I think there is nothing that stands in the way of this becoming a gigaton market.
Okay. And so to maybe summarize and like kind of do the crystal ball moment, what do you think the coming year will look like for CDR? What are your predictions based on your experience and the trends that you're noticing and we've discussed so far?
On the 26-27, on the supply side, I think we will see more and more smaller projects being developed and financed. We will see that happening not just in the countries where we currently see activities, but we will also see a massively ramped up activity in the global south, also in countries where there are currently not yet many projects. I think there's 1, 2 on the supply side. I'm expecting some final investment decisions and start build of some very large infrastructural projects on the backs and the duct sides. We will see enhanced rock weathering becoming a much more mature segment of the market. On the demand side, I'm expecting more financial intermediaries to come into this market that will be taking speculative positions. And we will see much more complex financial structures coming to market. And I think that will all happen in 26. So I think 26 is going to be an extremely exciting year, both from a supply and demand point of view, really moving to a much more mature market.
Since you mentioned enhanced rock weathering, I'm curious, do you see it as kind of like the pathway that would be following up on biochar? Do you see any pathway realistically kind of being able to compete with biochar?
No, I think every single technology will play its own role. And I think we can't predict exactly what the market is going to look like. But what I do think is that it's not just going to be a cost discussion. In the same way that in the power system, you have got relatively expensive generators of power that play a role within the context of dealing with peak demand for power. I think you will probably see the same happening in the engineered removal space. I can see various technologies that are easily switch on and switch offable, play a role that gas turbines, for example, play as peakers in the power system. And then price is not that relevant. So I think it will be a mix of technologies that is going to be playing out over the next couple of years. And that means that some projects will scale in different ways than others. I mean, rock weathering is interesting in that a large part of the cost is actually variable. If you can get those variable costs down, then that we should allow rock weathering to scale quite dramatically. So from a crystal ball point of view, and it's the same as with energy transition, it's going to be a mix of technologies that is going to be making up this world over the next 10, 15 years. And I think all the technologies that people are currently talking about will probably play a role in that ecosystem in one way or another.
It's a very curious analogy that you made with the energy mix and like the different carbon removal pathways. Just to make sure I understood that correctly, does that mean that like the more expensive ones would benefit from this potential shortage of carbon credits, and like that's like those will be the pathways that have demand in times of like peak demand and, you know, supply shortage?
Yeah, I think if you look at what happens in the first round of voluntary carbon markets, there were a lot of companies that were struggling financially because they actually had promised deliveries of credits, of specific volumes of credits with specific vintages. And there were not really mechanisms out there to temporarily ramp up volumes of specific projects because of the way that the carbon market was structured, because, you know, you had annual audits and things like that, but also because of the characteristics of the technologies. Whereas if you are looking at engineered removals, I think what is very different between an engineered removal and a reduction credit or an avoidance credit, and especially if you start comparing with nature-based solutions. I mean, if you start a direct air capture project today, you can issue your first credits effectively tomorrow. And so you can imagine that if there are financial players that have signed contracts where they have to deliver certain volumes by a certain time, that price of credits is much less relevant than the ability to quickly generate a specific volume. And whether that's direct air capture or BECCS or rock weathering, maybe not, but or rock weathering or another technology doesn't really matter. But basically, I do expect that because of that fundamental difference between engineered removals and other types of projects, you can actually see a role for technologies that is actually dependent on the offtake contracts that have been signed by intermediaries or by developers to actually just be able to quickly ramp up and ramp down production based on specific demand. Or maybe as soon as you talk about proper liquid markets, it makes sense to ramp up and ramp down based on price signals. So I do see that happening in the engineered removal space in a totally different way than you see in other parts of carbon markets.
Okay. So JW, that brings me to my final question for today. What does Puro.earth have planned for the new year? Are there any exciting developments in the making that you can already give us a sneak peek of?
Yeah, so I think the most exciting one is one that is an announcement that's probably going to come through in January, February, where we really start moving from issuance based on, you know, monthly or annual time intervals to issuance on demand. So I think it's an extremely exciting point that when developers want to have an audit done, we should be able to actually issue us those credits on demand. And the way I've been talking about it is within the context, for example, of a BECCS project. I mean, BECCS projects, they capture CO2 from a combined heat and power system. You capture CO2, you store it on the boat, and then the boat goes to an offshore or an onshore storage site and the CO2 gets stored. I mean, their way of thinking is not in terms of months or years. Their way of thinking is, I've got a boat there, and one boatload is worth, I don't know, 2, 3, 4, 5 million euros worth of credits. Why not audit an issuance on a boatload by boatload basis? And I think that is one of those examples of things that we're launching in the next year that should really be a game changer for a lot of these developers, because it actually follows their operations rather than anything else. So I think that is one. I think two is we're working quite closely together with NASDAQ, with one of our shareholders, to really start looking at additional functionality when it comes to what is it that financial intermediaries are looking for. And so we will also announce a number of changes in our registry environment that are much more useful for financial intermediaries from a security point of view, but also from a functionality point of view. And then I think we will see quite a lot of extremely exciting large projects coming to market next year, which I think is super exciting as well. And then obviously within the context of regulatory stuff, I'm very much hoping that we will get some of our methodologies now CCP approved under ICVCM in the first couple of months of the new year as well. Well, I think that is those are the main things that we're focusing on, is how we can actually really stabilize our infrastructure and add additional functionality in order to really become that bedrock of the engineered removal market.
Oh, it definitely sounds like a very, very exciting year ahead. I really can't wait for all these announcements to drop when they do. JW, thank you so much for your time today. It was wonderful to speak to you, and I wish you and Puro a very successful 2026 ahead.
Thank you very much, Vlad. It's an absolute pleasure.
If you enjoyed this episode of the Carbonsations podcast and would like to hear more conversations like this, please be sure to subscribe. We really appreciate the support.